Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are strapping in for a discussion about corporate failure, creative deflection, and just this increasingly volatile relationship between billion-dollar studios and, the independent voices of the fandom.
Yeah, and we're really zeroing in on the truly remarkable recent comments from Leslye Headland,
the showrunner of the now-canceled Star Wars show, The Acolyte.
It's an extraordinary moment of finger-pointing, really. It requires a serious unpacking because Headland isn't just, lamenting the show's failure.
No.
She is assigning specific, actionable blame for this massive project, failing not to its quality, not its budget, but directly to content creators, the critics and YouTubers online.
And that's the absolute core of our deep dive today. Our mission here is to take her specific claims, her financial critique of these creators, her very harsh categorization of them.
Oh, very harsh.
Using terms like fascists and snake oil salesmen, and just place them side by side with the explosive and, meticulously argued counterclaims from the very community she's going after.
And we have to do this while acknowledging the sheer absurdity of it all, something critics jumped on. You have this huge studio production that cost, by most accounts, close to $250 million.
$250 million.
And the showrunner is blaming its collapse on, the pennies and dollars being made by small, independent YouTube channels? I mean, the dissonance there between the cost of the failure and who she's blaming is honestly what makes it fascinating.
It really is. It sets up this perfect modern narrative, right? The legacy institution versus the decentralized, independent voice of the audience. But before we get into all the accusations, the fascism, the opportunism, we have to establish the context, the undeniable context of failure.
Exactly.
So let's get into section 1 and talk about the financial reality and how the studio actually handled this cancellation.
Yeah, we have to start with the raw data. And when you look at the data, it's brutal. Headland herself confirmed the show was not popular. It was, by any reasonable metric, an abject failure.
She said it herself.
She did. In her interview, she was really clear that she was not surprised by the cancel. And she cited the reaction and the criticism and the viewership. So, the failure was acknowledged, at least internally.
And the sources we've looked at paint a picture of just catastrophic financial mismanagement, which makes those low viewership numbers even more damning.
Oh, absolutely.
These financial metrics they're truly staggering. It elevates this from, just a creative disappointment to a real industry lesson. According to multiple sources, the show was astronomically expensive. It cost something like $600,000 per minute to film.
Think about that number for a moment. $600,000 for every 60 seconds of... It's kind of hard to even wrap your head around.
It really...
The total production estimate for The Acolyte was around $230 million. So when critics started dissecting this failure, the conversation immediately and rightly went to the visual return on that investment.
They weren't just criticizing the writing. They were asking, where did the money go?
Exactly. I recall one critic making a particularly scathing comparison. He argued that despite this astronomical sum, $230 million for one season, the final product just looked, subpar.
He said it looked like an episode like Deep Space Nine.
Right.
Like standard 90s syndicated TV.
Yeah, and that comparison is so important because it really gets to the technical side of the argument. We're not just throwing out big numbers, we're grounding them in what people actually saw on screen.
Right.
If your show looks visually the same as something made on a 1990s budget, but it costs hundreds of millions of modern dollars, the financial failure is compound. Critics were comparing it to prestige TV, where you expect groundbreaking effects or cinematography.
They just weren't seeing it here.
They weren't seeing it. So that budget becomes an immediate massive red flag for everyone.
And it was so much more expensive than other shows Disney decided to cancel. Sources pointed out that the fantasy series Willow...
also canceled.
It's also canceled. It reportedly cost about $17 million an episode. Now, that's still a lot of money, but the sheer total for The Acolyte north of $230 million was just immense. The lack of viewers made it completely unsustainable no matter what anyone was saying online.
And the sources confirm this. Lucasfilm's official line was tied directly to low viewership and the fact that it was just too expensive. It reinforces the argument the critics make later on, which is that all the negative commentary was just a symptom of a show that wasn't working.
It was a reflection of the problem, not the cause of it.
Precise. As one source put it, very bluntly, you just cannot sustain a show that costs that much with basically no viewership.
Okay, so let's pivot to how the cancellation was handled, because this is where Headland admitted she was surprised. Not that it was canceled, but how it was done.
Right, the procedure. She expressed surprise at the swiftness and the publicness of it. She mentioned that Disney quickly scrubbed associated products. They took things down and basically announced the show's end very public. She seemed to think it lacked a certain corporate courtesy.
And this is where you can start to feel a little bit of skepticism creep in, right? Because the historical context that the sources provide about her team's alleged actions before the show was even made, it makes her complaint about publicness sound pretty ironic to the critics.
Acutely ironic.
You're talking about the claims of PR manipulation. We should probably unpack that for the listener, but be really careful to just report what the sources alleged.
Of course. Critics allege that Headland and her team had previously engaged in these highly strategic PR campaigns. The claim is that stories were deliberately leaked or planted in the media.
To what end?
To suggest that if Disney did not greenlight the show, or if they tried to, change its creative vision, that it would be evidence of anti-lesbian bias or misogyny to executives.
So the allegation is that they were using the threat of a manufactured controversy as leverage to get the show made their way.
Exactly. Critics see it as a calculated attempt to, and I quote, bully executives into giving them more seasons and more chances, to create an environment where the show became too politically risky for the studio to cancel or interfere.
So if you accept that premise, then her being upset about the swiftness and publicness of the cancellation.
It feels incredibly tone-deaf to her critics. If you weaponize the media to get your project greenlit, you can't really be surprised when the studio shuts it down just as publicly when the numbers don't show up.
And the critics were very quick to contrast her experience with how other Star Wars people have been fired.
Oh, the comparison is stark, and it's really relevant to this whole critique of corporate hypocrisy. Critics pointed out that how the Acolyte was shut down was, in a corporate sense, relatively normal. She reportedly got specific communications about the criticism, the low viewership. Now, you compare that to the very public firing of Gina Carano. The sources noted that Carano found out she was fired only when a Lucasfilm representative tweeted publicly about her being heinous and deplorable. There was no direct communication.
So in the grand scheme of things, Headland got a phone call and a corporate shutdown, while others got a public shaming on social media. It really does put her complaint about the process into sharp focus.
It really does. So the context is set. The show was a colossal financial drain. It had low viewership, and Headland's own prior PR strategy allegedly involved leveraging media pressure. And this leads us perfectly into Section 2, where she tries to externalize all that blame onto the independent creators.
Right. And this is where the conversation shifts from financial failure to these moral and financial accusations against the critic. It starts with her financial critique, which critics immediately called the monetization.
She argued that content being streamed, by Netflix, by Disney Plus, is being snatched up by these other creators.
Snatched up.
Her word, for everything from commentaries and synopses, long live video. But she didn't just observe this ecosystem. She immediately chalked up all their work to pure financial motivation.
And she specifically pointed to their Patreons and their viewer-based ad revenue, right? She ended with that powerful statement that there's a lot of money to be made in this whole negative commentary.
Yeah. And the implication there, which is what creators found so offensive and reductive, was that the only reason anyone would bother to criticize the Acolyte or any modern Star Wars really was just to make a quick buck.
The immediate counterargument, though, focused on the sheer scale of the money. I mean, why are the pennies and dollars from a few individual creators the main point of discussion when her show's filming costs $600,000 a minute?
It's a huge irony. Critics argued that the idea that their, relatively modest revenue streams, often just enough to make it a full-time job, could somehow sink a $230 million production. Laughable. It completely lacks scale and perspective. Her focus on their Patreon accounts seems so trivial next to the vast financial chasm of her own failure.
And the creator community, they were quick to defend the why, the reason their channel. They push back hard against that profit only.
They argue that for so many of them, their channels were born out of real passion, which was then followed by real disappointment. They weren't starting these channels hoping Star Wars would fail.
No, quite the opposite.
Exactly. They started them because they loved the IP and felt, increasingly betrayed by its direction. Creators like Snarky J, for instance, specifically said he started his channel to talk about his excitement, which then quickly turned into talking about his disappointment with shows like The Book of Boba Fett.
So the narrative they're pushing is one of emotional investment driving the analysis. They argue if they were truly only motivated by profit, they'd pivot to something easy, or maybe just stick to lore videos that everyone likes.
Right, the uncontroversial stuff. But the outrage and the critical analysis are driven by the audience's real-world reaction to a product they feel is just substandard.
So what one creator, the critical drinker, said was that Headland's perspective is biased because she only talks to legacy media.
Yes, exactly. And his claim is that those outlets typically give positive or at least restrained reviews to maintain their sweet access to cast and crew interviews.
They need to stay on the good side of the studio.
Whereas the negative commentary sphere, it functions without that corporate pressure. It means it's just a raw, unfiltered reflection of a bad product that the vast majority of the audience didn't like or...
And that really sets the stage for her next and far more incendiary set of claims, her categorization of critics into this very damaging gamut.
Yeah.
She made a distinction between critics she respects, that gave positive, and those she saw as these negative forces.
And this classification, it escalates significantly. She moved from a financial critique to basically character assassination. She labeled the negative forces as absolutely snake oil salesmen, then just opportunists, and finally she went to the political, the fascists and racists.
Start with snake oil salesmen. The critics immediately challenged her to even define that. Does it just mean anyone who disliked the show? It feels like a convenient way to dismiss feedback without actually addressing it?
It's incredibly reductive. Critics argue that snake oil salesman implies that they're lying about their feelings just for profit, and this is something creators strongly deny. They point out that keeping up a lie over hundreds of hours of live streams and commentary would be tiring, exhausting, and fundamentally...
Right.
They say it's much easier and more sustainable to just be honest and just say what you think, because that authenticity is what their audience expects. So the implication is that anyone who genuinely disliked the show is automatically a fraud in her eyes.
And then came that political escalate. She just jumped from opportunists looking for money straight to the fascists and racists. This is where the sources show the creators felt the accusation was just mindlessly dismissed.
They all labeled it a tired deflection. They argue it's an attempt to use the severe, loaded language to bully people into liking subpar content and shame critics into silence.
Yeah.
One source noted that this term has been applied so often to any creative criticism that it literally means nothing at this point. It's lost its power. It's just become a generic tool to deflect from creative failure.
Okay, now we need to address the source's claims about the irony surrounding Headland's own professional background, particularly her production band. This is complex, so we have to report on the allegations impartially.
This is a really crucial point for context. Headland runs a production banner called Shoot to Mid. Critics raised some serious concerns, alleging that this banner was fundamentally discriminatory in its focus. The claim was that the company's stated mission was to focus only on elevating unacknowledged or underrepresented female voices.
So what was the critics' interpretation of that in the context of her using terms like racist and fascist for her detractors?
They argued it was a profound hypocrisy. They claimed that Headland, who was running a production company focused on activity only, hiring or promoting services based on identity, was then turning around and using these severe political labels to dismiss people who criticized her work.
I see.
As one source put it, how can you call others ists and phobes when you run a discriminatory company yourself which only hires women? They saw this as a huge failure of self-awareness and moral, that she was using identity politics to shield a financially and creatively failed product.
It's an alleged double standard that the critics just seized upon to undermine her authority in this whole conversation. And on top of that, they were skeptical about where she was even getting these labels from.
Exactly. Headland herself admitted she was not online and was only getting the weather report from friends and coworkers.
So she wasn't even watching the video.
It suggests she wasn't. She wasn't personally viewing the thousands of hours of content or engaging in the comment sections. She was relying on filtered, secondhand characterizations from people who were maybe defending her work. Critics argue that makes her use of labels like fascist highly suspect. It's based on hearsay.
And then the incredible irony of the patronage relationship. Headland admitted she financially supported some of these very critics on Patreon for years. She said she'd always been part of the Star Wars recap criticism, Carrianization fandom community.
This detail is just astonishing. She was essentially a paying member of the community she is now condemning.
Right.
And the community immediately asked, does your past financial support now shield your work? She implied that because she knew who these guys are and supported them on Patreon, they should have somehow pulled their punches or not found her show to be ass, as one creator so eloquently put it.
It changes the whole attack. It's not just a critique of the creator community anymore. It becomes this personal betrayal narrative. She tries to invalidate their critiques first by attacking their finances, second by their morals, and third by claiming this personal relationship that should have given her immunity.
And that profound disappointment, the real force driving these channels, is what brings us to section. This is where the creators respond, arguing that they aren't a negative force at all. They're actually providing the best, most candid focus group Hollywood ever asked for.
And this shift in perspective is fascinating. Headland herself kind of conceded this. She said there's a misunderstanding between studios and the engagement from creators, and she noted studios often use it almost like this focus group.
And that tiny crack of acknowledgement just opened the door for the critics' most compelling counterargument.
Which is what?
They agreed, unanimously, that it is a focus, but they argued it's an incredibly sophisticated and efficient one. You have to think about the structure of YouTube fandom. If you subscribe to a channel like The Critical Drinker or Star Wars Theory, which have millions of subscribers...
You're doing it because you generally align with their opinions and their tone?
Exact. So those channels aren't just attracting random viewers. They represent these massive, self-selected chunks of the actual engaged Star Wars audience. It's highly targeted demographic segmentation.
And crucially, it's completely free for Hollywood.
Completely free.
Yeah.
Creators provide autistic levels of detail, breaking down every single aspect of a project. And that analysis is immediately validated or challenged by the audience right there in the comment sections.
Right.
We're talking about streams with thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of comments, either agreeing or disagreeing. This is real-time, highly detailed, voluntary feedback that traditional paid focus groups just cannot replicate.
The Critical Drinker highlighted where this power comes from. He argued that this engagement is generated by people with an actual emotional investment in the thing, the hardcore audience.
Yes, not disinterested normies or... and this is a term we should probably explain, raid activists.
What are raid activists?
It's a term that comes up in YouTube discourse. It refers to people who might try to artificially boost or silence certain creators by, flooding their comments or reporting them. The point that critics were making is that the vast majority of their viewership isn't manufactured. It comes from a large, genuine core of the fandom that is truly invested in the IP.
So the critical channels are just articulating the collective feeling of that passionate base.
They are. And one of the most powerful arguments the sources made is that Hollywood didn't just stumble upon this critical YouTube ecosystem.
Yeah.
They actively created it.
This is the central argument for creative accountability.
Absolutely. Critics argued that Disney and Lucasfilm are directly responsible for this successful, critical YouTube sphere because they have consistently produced bad media that disillusioned the fan base for the last decade.
People who loved Star Wars but hated the direction it was going.
They gravitated toward channels that were saying what they felt. The channels became the emotional outlet for the audience. It led one creator to state, with some satisfaction, that we were created by people like...
It's the ultimate feedback. Creative failure feeds audience disillusionment, which feeds the critical commentary machine, which then becomes more successful than the creative product itself.
And Star Wars Theory is often cited as a perfect example of this shift. He didn't start as a critic. He used to make these elaborate lore videos and fan films.
I remember those.
But the sources noted that his fan-centric content eventually stopped getting views because the audience just lost interest in the official IP.
So he shifted his focus. His channel now is mostly covering the drama around Star Wars, the controversies, the failures, the business side of it, because that's what the disillusioned audience is actually engaging with. Channels that praise the Acolyte didn't get high viewership because the underlying product was so widely disliked.
And this reality, that the critique is more compelling than the product, is what led Headland to make that incredibly bold yet almost self-defeating prediction.
Right, that the content being made about Star Wars will eventually be more culturally impactful than actual Star Wars.
A devastating admission, coming from someone who used to make official Star Wars content. And critics largely agreed with her. But they treated it as an absolute indictment of the creative state of the franchise, not as some side effect of aggressive...
They saw her prediction as a testament to how absolutely shit your writing and your production has got.
That's the one. The prevailing opinion among the sources is that current Star Wars has just been reduced to this dull, unimaginative corporate product. It's diluted by a constant, low-quality stream of releases that actively pushes the audience away.
And the anecdotal evidence is powerful here. The most common viewer comment was, "I watch your videos, I don't watch this show." That means the commentary, the criticism, the drama, the humor in the YouTube sphere, it's all become more entertaining, more culturally relevant, and more engaging than the official IP itself.
Before we move on, though, we do need to add a bit of historical context. While critics are blaming Headland and Disney, we have to acknowledge that Star Wars has always been contentious. This isn't entirely new, but the scale of the apathy is.
Absolutely. The sources remind us that the Star Wars fandom has a long, contentious history. You had massive fan division over Return of the Jedi versus Empire decades ago.
Oh, yeah.
The vicious attacks on George Lucas over the prequels were a major reason he sold the franchise to Disney in the first place. This is not a fandom that just sits quietly and accepts what it's given.
The crucial difference now, according to the sources, is generalized audience appetite. That's a much bigger factor than active anger. Critics argue that years of poor content, shows like Book of Boba Fett and Obi-Wan Kenobi, had already eroded the faith of the casual.
So a lot of the normal people just stopped caring. They stopped watching new stuff whether a YouTuber told them to or not. They weren't necessarily angry. They were just fatigued.
Exactly. And if your non-engaged audience has already moved on, then a $230 million show is doomed, no matter how loud the online commentary is, positive or negative.
And that leads us right into the heart of the creative controversy in Section 4.
Yeah.
The deep dive into Headland's own creative philosophy, which critics argue fundamentally undermined the IP, and this whole question of creative accountability.
Right.
This section relies heavily on her own words from interviews, which critics cited extensively, particularly her revelation that The Acolyte wasn't just a Star Wars show, it was her personal fanfiction.
And this is probably the most crucial point in understanding the creative pushback. Critics cited interviews where she revealed The Acolyte was conceptually centered around her specifically her relationship with her dying father.
That framework became the core artistic lens of the entire show.
It did, and this personal framework reportedly drove the show's whole philosophy shift, putting it immediately at odds with the established theme Star Wars. Well, Headland allegedly said in interviews that she was always drawn to the dark side of the Force, and she questioned what was so bad about embracing the dark side.
Which is a pretty fundamental misunderstanding of Star Wars.
Critics interpreted it as the show's underlying and destructive message. Star Wars is built on the idea of simple morality, of resisting temptation and choosing. Headland's alleged philosophical stance of questioning the value of the light side fundamentally changed the nature of the Force itself.
And critics analyze the allegorical structure in intense detail. They argue that her personal feelings, specifically her feelings of failing her father's expectations, were mapped directly onto the narrative's climax.
Yes, the sources highlighted the show's very controversial final act. The protagonist, Osha, kills her father figure, Saul, who dies telling her it's okay.
Right.
And critics detailed Headland's alleged comments after, where she complained that Saul, even in death, was taking away her agency by absolving her.
So critics interpreted this specific creative decision as Headland projecting a seething or unresolved relationship with her own father onto a Star Wars story.
And making the $230 million production her own personal fan fiction about her own life. And this personal investment, critics argued, just fundamentally clashed with the simple, clear narrative that had defined the franchise for decades.
The monomyth, the hero's journey.
The conflict between light and dark. The whole arc of the original trilogy is Luke bringing his father, Vader, back. Critics argued Headland reversed this, making the choice to embrace the dark side, an act of personal liberation instead of corruption. They concluded it was destructive, personal revenge porn fanfic that mutilated the core IP.
Whether or not the audience saw that creative philosophy is evil or destructive, we have to circle back to the central theme here, accountability.
Yes.
Critics point out that her continued deflection blaming YouTubers shows a profound refusal to take accountability for creative or financial failure.
It's the continuous inability to look inward and just say, you know what, we overestimated our audience's interest, or we missed the mark creative. The sources note that years later, she is still falling back on these external. The failure was due to financial opportunism, or maybe if the right audience.
But the sources are very clear on the actual corporate reason for the cancellation. The online commentary, positive or negative, was secondary to the spreadsheet.
Absolutely. The sources all agree that The Acolyte was canceled because expensive, it had basically no viewership. The negative commentary was a reflection of a failed product, not the engine that drove. A $230 million bomb just can't survive on reflection alone.
And the recurring dominant theme among all the content creators is this plea to the studios. If you would just make something good for a change and stop hiring creators with what they call a rotten mentality, the critical YouTube sphere would disappear, or at least shift back to harmless lore videos.
They argue that Hollywood is just trying to use the critical community as a scapegoat for their own internal failures in quality and cost. They maintain that the success of critical commentary is proof that there's a demand for better content.
It's a simple equation.
It is. If the fans are happy, the critics don't get the views. If the content is bad, the critics thrive by articulating that collective audience point.
So Headland's deflection is seen as the final act of a production that lost touch with its audience, produced a vanity project, failed spectacularly, and then just refused to look internally for the reason.
And critics view her and her cohorts as figures who are entrusted with hundreds of millions of dollars, often as a virtue signal, and delivered trash back to the audience. By blaming the content creators, she's ultimately blaming the very audience members who watch and support them.
Which brings us to the synthesis of this whole deep dive. We started with this astounding interview from Leslye Headland, where she tried to blame the audience's reflection, the YouTube, rather than the source material's creative quality or the show's spectacular financial cost.
And we've seen how that critique was systematically dismantled by the creator. They argue they function as Hollywood's most candid, free, and comprehensive focus group ecosystem, ironically, that Hollywood itself created through years of disillusioning creative and financial oversight.
The core conflict is really just a refusal by the legacy structure to accept accountability for a $230 million financial and creative failure.
It is, and the consensus from the sources suggests that we may be witnessing an irreversible cultural shift, captured perfectly by Headland's own word. The conversation about Star Wars is becoming more valuable and impactful than Star Wars itself.
And that leaves us with a provocative thought for you to consider moving.
If the discussion, the drama, the analysis, and the criticism surrounding a beloved franchise now carry more cultural weight, generate more sustained engagement, and are simply more entertaining than the official stories being told, what does that signify for the long-term health of these beloved intellectual properties?
If the official narrative fails to engage and the independent commentary thrives on that very failure, are we watching the final transition where the era of the monolithic blockbuster IP officially gives way to the era of commentary?
The audience is voting with its eyeballs, not just on the streaming service, but on YouTube. And right now, the most entertaining, culturally impactful Star Wars story being told is the story of the IP's own decline and the controversies that come with it. It certainly feels like we're watching the conversation consume the product.
Something for all of us to mull over until the next big creative controversy hits the entertainment cycle.